Thank you. We're in the book of Esther. I don't know whether you know much about the book of Esther, and I'm conscious that there may be people here today that weren't here last week, and I would have missed Paul's introduction and the first couple of chapters at looking at the book of Esther. So I just want to recap briefly and put the book into a historical setting, because these are real people. It was a real situation that we're looking at. This isn't fiction or anything like that. It is real. And so the king at the centre of the book of Esther, this is the king. His name is Ahasuerus. He's the emperor of the Persian Empire. So he's really the most powerful man in the world at the time. Historians tend to call him Xerxes. Xerxes the first, or Xerxes the Great. And he's the father of the great king Darius that's mentioned in the book of Daniel. You'll perhaps know something of the book of Daniel. Daniel and the lions then, well, it was the lions, it was Darius was there then. And his mother, that's Ahasuerus' mother, was the daughter of King Cyrus. So that's how they come together as well. He's another great king that's mentioned in the book of Daniel. And if you go to the British Library, then there's lots and lots in the British, not the British Library, in the British Museum. In the British Museum, there's lots and lots in there about all of this period. It's a real period in real history. And the whole of this book takes place in the city of Susa, which is the capital of the Persian Empire at the time. So Ahasuerus took over from his father Darius. When Darius tried to conquer Greece, he went to war against Greece, and to show that he was as great a king as his father, we learned last week, throws a 6-month drunken party, culminating in what he hopes would be the display of his beautiful queen Vashti. Now, if historians have got it right, then Vashti may well have been expecting a baby at this very time. And it may have been for that reason that she didn't want to come and be displayed to everybody, I don't know. But not that she should have been asked to come and just be looked at by all these drunken men anyway. But that may have been an additional reason. But the king, being humiliated by her refusal to attend his banquet, well, then the king decides that he is sacking Vashti. She is no longer going to be the queen. He'll go looking for a new queen. He's all powerful. He can do what he wants, and that's what he decides to do. And the whole of that process of looking for a new queen takes 4 years. Now, it takes 4 years for all sorts of things. One of them is that he was probably, during that time, off fighting another war against Greece to try and avenge the death of his father. He's trying to finish the job that his father never did, and which incidentally he failed to do as well, as history shows us. Anyway, when he gets back, he's got this whole group of women that have been brought from all over as prospective queens. And to find out which is the one that he wants, he sleeps with each one of them for a night. And that means that those women are then spoiled, because they can't marry anybody else, because they've already slept with somebody else. So they're impure, so nobody else would want them. So it's ruined all of their lives as he goes looking for his new queen. And he decides that the one that he likes the best is Esther. So she is going to be the queen in Vashti's place. And it's almost there that sort of all good storybooks finish, because normally you'd expect the words, and they all lived happily ever after, to come after that. But that's not what real life is like, and it's not what real life was like all these years ago. And what Ahasuerus does not realise about Esther, although quite how he doesn't realise it, I don't know, but he doesn't realise it. He doesn't realise that she's Jewish. doesn't realise that she's a Jew, and that since her parents' death, she has been living with her cousin Mordecai. And we left it last week with Mordecai, who by this time had become an official in the king's court, so he'd done well for himself. But we left it with him overhearing a plot to assassinate the king, and him telling Esther about this so that Esther could tell the king, which she does, and the two traitors are caught and they're tried and they're executed. But actually Mordecai seems to get very little thanks for all of his efforts in that. But that is something that will be picked up later. So that little recap brings us to where we are today, which is chapter 3. Now, if you've got a Bible in front of you, then that's going to be helpful. And Esther's not that difficult to find. If you go right in the middle, you'll usually hit the book of Psalms, and you just go forward towards the start of the Bible, 2 books, and you're in the book of Esther. And in chapter 3, right when we get to chapter 3, there's another member of the cast that we're introduced to right at the beginning. And his name is Haman. Now, Haman, in all good stories, there has to be a baddie. And if there's a baddie in this one, it is Haman. Although we've got that king who doesn't seem to be much of a goodie. But Haman is very much the baddie. And Haman suddenly appears on the scene. We've never heard about him before this in the book. And he appears there because he's suddenly been promoted. He's been promoted right to the top because there's 2 people that have been executed. And therefore 2 of the close people to the king who were plotting to overthrow him have been executed. There's a gap there, and Haman's promoted into it. And at the beginning of the chapter, we read this: "And these things, King Ahasuerus, after these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage." Now, you have to ask yourself the question, well, why was there some animosity between Mordecai, who seems to be a thoroughly decent chap and is Jewish? Why is there some animosity between him and this new person who suddenly appeared on the scene, who's Haman? Well, Haman is a descendant of a people that were always a thorn in the side of God's people. You notice in the reading it says that he's an Agagite. Well, that is they were a people that always were against God, always were against God's people. And it seems that Haman has inherited that trait through the family line. Simon was speaking about institutional things. Just think of the things that you might believe because that's what your family always believed. That's what you've always been taught. Well, Haman was always taught that to hate Jews, and he hated Jews. And he had no time for God's people. And to be honest, he had no time for God either. So when we get down to verse 8, we read, Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talent of silver," that's about 3 tons, okay, of silver, "into the hands of those who have the charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Then the king's scribes were summoned on the 13th day of the first month, and an edict according to all that Haman commanded was written to the king's satraps. They're like his governors in all different parts of the kingdom, and to the governors over all the provinces, and to the officials of all the peoples, to every province in its own script, and every people in its own language. It was written in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed with the king's signet ring. Letters were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the document was to be issued as a decree in every province by proclamation to all the peoples to be ready for that day. The couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa the citadel, and the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Now that was quite a long section there just to read, but I hope it gives you a flavour for the kind of situation that these people are living in. The Jewish people here are living in a situation where the top man wants them a knife. So the two situations, when you look at these situations in the Bible and you think, well, that could never happen again, well, it's kind of happening now. But it gives you a kind of a picture, reading through all that gives you a picture of what the political situation was like at the time, and that shrouds really the whole of the book. And whether we're talking about international politics or national politics or local politics, or we're talking about our own families or our own personal lives, there is one behind the scenes in this world who is always trying to sour and destroy and corrupt the good things that God is trying to do in this world. He's always trying to do that. He's doing it in our lives, he's doing it in our world. And God is a good God, and he will always do right. That doesn't mean to say he will always do nice. He doesn't always do nice, but he always does right. And Satan is trying to spoil all of that. And Haman here is a gullible but willing tool in the hands of Satan. As Satan tries to completely eradicate God's people, he wants the Jewish people eradicated, and he wants them eradicated for one really good reason, and that's this. If every Jew is dead, then the Saviour cannot come. The Messiah cannot come. Because Jesus is going to come through that line. He's going to come through that family. He's going to come through that nation. And if the nation is destroyed, then Satan has won. And the Messiah can't come. But all through history, God has always had someone strategically placed before the events take place to thwart Satan and further his own purposes. Sometimes even using Satan's own tactics against him. So sometimes Satan tries to do something and that works actually really against him and he doesn't realise it before. Anyway, back to the story. Haman has this superstitious game to decide on what day the Jews are going to decide. It's almost like throwing dice, that kind of thing. He doesn't want it to take place too soon. He doesn't want the Jews eradicated too soon because he wants them all eradicated on one day, one giant, great, universal act. And therefore, it's going to take time to get the messages out throughout the whole of the empire. So it can't happen tomorrow. He doesn't want it to happen too quick. It's got to happen on a day sometime in the future when the messages have got all over the whole of the empire. And on that one day, every Jew throughout the whole of the Persian Empire, throughout the whole of the known world, will die, according to Haman. And to get the king's interest, he offers this enormous amount of money. Which does get the king's interest because the king has lost a lot of money in all of these wars off with Greece. He's poorer now than he's ever been. So the huge amount of money is there. And the king really becomes a bit like putty in the hands of Haman. And Satan will often offer us things that seem wonderful and even sometimes opportune. They come just at the right time. You might find it in your own life. There's something that's there in front of you and it's a real opportunity, a wonderful opportunity for you or whatever it might be. But let's remember this. Satan can only work in our lives if we consent to it. He can only do evil in our lives if we consent to it. And Haman is happy to be used by Satan, and now the king is being surreptitiously drawn into his schemes as well. And of course, the biggest problem for the king is that the king doesn't realise that there is a problem. He doesn't realise that all of this is happening. He doesn't realise that he's being drawn into all of this, because that's how the devil works, and that's how he works in our lives as well. He does it so subtly that sometimes we don't even realise that he's working behind the scenes. And that's what's happening here for the king. Now, there is a special rule in the Persian Empire. In fact, they had lots of special rules, but there is one special rule that they were known for, and that is that once a command had been issued and it had been sealed with the king's ring, it could never, under any circumstances, be reversed. It could never be rescinded, not even by the one who issued the command, not even by the king. Once it is issued, it is issued. It is set, not in sand, but set in stone. And the king, therefore, has just agreed and had it sealed with his own ring, the annihilation of a whole nation. It's genocide. It's complete ethnic cleansing of his empire. All Jews on one day will all die. You know, sometimes the smallest and easiest decisions, taken in haste or at a time when we're weak, can have the greatest consequences. Sometimes you might have even done the same, in blissful ignorance of the consequences. And even if you think you can reverse it later, it always leaves a mark. There was a carpenter who was trying to teach his son a lesson about how sometimes you can't undo the things you've done. And he got a nail and a piece of wood at the doorpost, and he took the nail and he banged the nail in home. And he gave the claw hammer to his son, and he said to his son, "Now take out the nail." So the son put the claw hammer in, drew out the nail. There we are. There's the nail, even straight. The carpenter said to him, "Now take out the hole." Because it just leaves the hole. There's always a mark with these things. So sometimes when you think, oh, well, I could always go back, there's always a mark that is left there. And there's certainly a mark there that's left for this king and for the country. And so in this cosy little scene at the end of what we read there, where they're sitting there sipping wine together, convinced that they've taken a wise step, the king is convinced that he's done the right thing, but he's deluded and he's deceived. And he sits there with Haman, this evil man, and they're celebrating, whilst outside the city is in uproar. Not just amongst God's people, the city is in uproar. So it is amongst everybody. Everybody is perplexed at this edict that has been sent throughout the whole of the empire. Now, Mordecai is not immune from those feelings. Never think that because you're one of God's people that you're immune from feeling. And in chapter 4, we read, when Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes. Now, last week, Paul drew our attention to the fact that God's name is not mentioned in the whole of the book of Esther. And up to now, it doesn't even look like he's been behind any of the scenes. The whole thing looks as if it somehow got out of control, because the whole of the people of Israel are going to be annihilated. They're going to be executed on the same day. And sometimes, in our lives, we think, I don't know where God is in this. Well, he's there. In the same way as he is here in this situation here. We just can't see it yet. But he's there behind the scenes. He's there and he's orchestrating lots of things that are taking place. And gradually, as the book begins to unfold, as we move through this week and next week and the other weeks, you'll gradually see God's hand more and more and more, even though his name is not mentioned. Anyway, Mordecai sends word to Esther about this edict. She's in the palace. She's locked away. She doesn't even know about this. So Mordecai sends a message to her, begging her to intervene with the king. And it's your people. They're your people as well as my people. They're Jewish people. We're all Jews here, and it's Jews who are going to be annihilated. And don't think that you're going to escape either. They'll find out you're a Jew, you won't escape either. And Esther is nervous about going to the king for two reasons, really. First is, well, at the moment, the king doesn't know that she is Jewish. And he's just signed the death warrant for everyone, and hers along with him. So she doesn't know whether she'll be welcomed there or not. The second is another strange rule that they had in the Persian Empire, and that is that nobody was allowed to go to the king unless the king invited them, unless the king said you could come and see me. You just couldn't rock up and expect to see the king or anything like that. So there's no self-invitation. That you can't just do that. Even if you're the queen, you can't do that. And the truth was that the rule was, if you did that if you turned up without an invitation, then the punishment for everybody was the same, and that was death. Now, I don't know who drew these rules and regulations up. They seem a bit draconian to me, but they were the rules, and Esther knows that that is the rule. And at this point, the queen, Esther, hasn't seen the king for a month. So the idea of suddenly inviting yourself in to see him is for her a bit of a no-no. Now, you might expect Mordecai to be absolutely crestfallen when he hears the reply from Esther, that she's really nervous, she doesn't really want to do this. But Mordecai is in no doubt whatsoever that God will spare his people, because he knows that the Messiah is coming. He knows that all this is happening. That's not hidden from him. And he knows that God will spare his people. But he's equally in no doubt that if Esther doesn't act on their behalf, then she is the one who's going to be missing out on the experience of God intervening and God working. He's always going to bring about his purposes, and she could miss out in not being used if she doesn't get involved now. I wonder if that's ever happened to us, whether you look back and you can think, because I failed to get involved there, because I failed to help out there, because I failed to do something on that occasion, well, it all worked its way out. God still worked his purposes, but I just wasn't involved in it. Maybe you can look back at times in your life where that's happened. Maybe it's happening right now. Anyway, Mordecai sends Esther back a reply. This is by means of a go-between. There's a sort of go-between who's going between them. And by the means of this go-between, the message comes back. And we read in chapter 4 and verse 13, "Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther, 'Do not think yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this.'" God has infinite numbers of ways to accomplish his will. You and I may fail in the things he gives us to do, but that's never going to stop him accomplishing what he wants to accomplish. He'll raise up another. If you don't want to get involved, he'll raise up somebody else to do it anyway, and you'll be the person who misses out. He's always going to bring deliverance for his people, but he might just bring it from a different quarter if you don't want to be the person involved. God is never hindered by man's failure. But if we fail to be involved, we'll be the ones who miss out, not him. Anyway, Esther is obviously struck by Mordecai's words. And she asked Mordecai to get all the Jews in the city to fast. And she will fast with her handmaidens. They're all going to fast for 3 days. And she says, after the 3 days, I'll go to the king. And she says these words to Mordecai, "If I perish, I perish." Now, you and I would do well to adopt a similar attitude to that. If we die, we die. Recognising that our death, your death, my death, is not in our own hands anyway, and should not be in our own hands anyway. Neither is it in the hands of anybody else. Your life and my life sits in God's hands. And so we would do well to adopt a similar attitude. If I perish, I perish. If I die, I die. Our very lives sit in God's hands. So then we read, on the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on the royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favour in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden sceptre that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the sceptre, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." So because of her incredible beauty and the shallow nature of the king, Esther gains entry into the king's throne room where he is. And he's still making grand gestures. He's made grand gestures to everybody. He's made grand gestures right on the first day that Paul talked about last week, with all the things he was talking about then and boasting. He's made grand gestures to Haman. Yeah, we'll do that, Haman. We'll sit down and drink wine now while the country goes to rack and ruin, but, you know, I'll do what you say. Now he's making a grand gesture that says you can have anything you want up to half of the kingdom, half of the whole empire. Basically, she can have anything that she wants. She could ask him to cancel the extermination of the Jewish people. But she knows that the king can't do that. He can't cancel his own edict, and she knows that. So she invites him and Haman to a dinner party. Come to dinner. And of course, they both happily agree to go. So they do. They go to dinner with Queen Esther. There's just the three of them there with people serving. And at that feast, that night, that dinner party, the king asks again, "What is your wish?" And he says again, "I'll certainly grant it up to the half of the kingdom." And she says, "I'll tell you what, why don't you come back for another dinner party tomorrow night? And when you come back tomorrow, I will tell you on that day exactly what I wish for. I'll declare it to you on the next day." And Haman leaves the first dinner party, and then there's going to be the second one. He leaves the first one, and he's absolutely ecstatic. I've been to dinner with the king and queen. I'm the only one who was there. He leaves, and he's clicking his heels up the road as he goes. And as he goes up the road, who's sitting there? Mordecai. Everybody else is bowing down to him as he goes up the road as happy as can be. Mordecai, he doesn't bow down to him. He bows down only before the God of heaven. He will not bow down before an evil man like Haman. And so Haman's delight turns to, there's a bitterness in his mouth. But when he goes home, he calls all his friends together, his family together, and he boasts about all his greatness. He boasts about the fact he's been to dinner with the king and queen, and that it was only him who was there. Nobody else got invited, just me, because I'm so great. And he's boasting about this to everybody. But there is still that one fly in the ointment, Mordecai. And it's eating into him. And just in case you think that there are not too many people around like Haman, not too many bitter, twisted, evil people around like Haman, not too many self-absorbed, big-headed, evil-hearted people, his wife chips in. And his wife says to him, "If Mordecai is such a nuisance to you, I'll tell you what you should do. You should erect a great stake, a great pole in the middle of the city, 75 feet high, that's 25 metres in new money, high, and you should nail Mordecai to it." In the scriptures it says a gallows. It doesn't mean a gallows, it means a great spike, a great pole, and nail him to it. That's what you should do. So just in case you think Haman's the only one who's got an evil heart, it seems as if his wife is pretty much of that bent too. I don't know, but I wonder if you can think of another person, another Jewish person, that people wanted to nail up high for all to see. Haman is symbolic of all the sin in man. And all of that sin nailed Jesus to the cross. Next week we'll see how God's plan unveils itself even more, and God reveals more of his wonderful character. Let's pray. Father, we just thank you for the opportunity of looking into your word. We thank you for the truth of it. We thank you for the historicity of this whole book, of everything that took place. But we thank you that you are there with people who at the time can't see you, don't know that you're there, but you are there with them, working your purposes through. And in just that same way, sometimes we doubt whether you're with us, and yet you are there behind the scenes in our lives, in our world, and you're working your purposes out. And Father, we want to be part of that. Just encourage us in these things, we pray. We ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus.